Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Let's give everyone a couple of minutes and we'll get started in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Just giving everyone a couple of minutes to get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you once again for joining the Our Warming Planet webinar. We've been having these since the launch in February. So this is the 11th bi-weekly webinar. And thank you so much for sticking with us through all of this. We are now approaching the last couple of months and we'll give you an update on what's coming up as well. For today's lecture, we have Gary Yohe, who will be talking to us about a risk management approach to climate change using examples from IPCC assessments. And Gary's co-authors on the chapter were Richard Richards and Henry Jacoby from EPRI and MIT in the US. And I mentioned this to Gary when we were in the practice session earlier, but I have a little anecdote. This is very exciting for me because I first came across Gary's very interesting research on detection and attribution in 2004-05 when I was doing my master's in biodiversity conservation. It was such a big paper then. And I remember citing it over and over again. So this is very exciting for me as well. And so let's get started. Jen, if you could switch over to the next slide, please. So I invite Cynthia Rosenzweig to introduce the book editors and let's get going. Over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Manishka. Yes, and welcome, Gary, and welcome everybody who's online to the webinar, our Warming Planet webinar series. The book is very special because we gathered many colleagues of our colleague Martin Parry. These are the editors of the book. And pretty much everybody said yes, they wanted to write and prepare a lecture really in honor of the leadership that Martin Parry has provided the field of climate change impacts and adaptation. So Martin is one of the key the keystone editor of the book. And is now visiting professor at the Center for Environmental Policy, Imperial College London, and was very notably co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 2 for the 4th assessment. And I also want to highlight so much the editorship of Manishka Demel and her leadership really for the webinar series. She's a senior staff associate at Columbia University, now Columbia Climate School, but with us at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, where she leads the portfolio, our research portfolio in conservation and development. And so with that, really are so happy to share the book, which is a unique book. I think David's going to talk about how the series of the books really is a new concept for really providing key information for the widest possible use about, in this case, about climate change. So David, over to you for discussing the series.
Thank you, Cynthia. As you can see from the slide, there are 3 books as part of this series so far. The third book is not yet out. That'll be out in October. And as Cynthia implied, these are very different types of quote unquote textbooks associated with climate change. The thought behind them was that a lot of people talk about climate change, but there are very few real courses in climate change around the world because climate change doesn't actually fit into any particular department. It's not really in an atmospherics department. It's not in a physics department. So many people do not have slides available or information available specifically designed for a course. Hence the rationale behind these books, which have on the order of 20 different chapters in each of the books. And associated with the chapter is about a 5-page write-up and then 20 slides, PowerPoint slides that are available to everybody who orders the book. And these can be used in classrooms. They can be used in just meetings with other people of any sort of nature. And that will spread the information around on climate change. In the first book, it was climate dynamics. The book we're discussing here, of course, is climate change impacts and adaptation. So the webinar series is done by the different authors of those chapters. So in addition, and this is really in addition to the book, you not only from the book get the slides and the information, you also have available the actual discussion of the slides and the topic by the authors who wrote them. So we're trying to cover all bases with the books. Thank you. Back to you, Manishka.
Thanks so much, David. And this is what we have planned for you today. So we are in the introduction and getting to know the audience section of today's webinar. Then after that, we have lecture 18 from the book. So we progressed pretty far. Gary Yohe will talk about a risk management approach to climate change with examples from IPCC assessments. Then we have the live Q&A session moderated by Jen Evans. And there's a Q&A box in Zoom that you can send questions to any time. And then we will have a brief wrap up at the end. Next slide, Jen. Thank you. Great. And to the next slide. And I'm now going to, we can actually go back to the previous slide. Sorry about that. And now I'm going to, you've heard a lot about the editors and you will very soon hear a little bit about Gary, but we also want to know, get to know the audience. So just want to start this poll and see, where you're joining us from, what sector you work on. So let's get started. So the first question is, and hopefully this has popped up on your screen, is the geographical region of our participants. So we have more than half the participants who have yeah, great. We are now up to about 67 of the participants who are participating in this. And there was, during one of the first few, we even had Oceania, but it's very late in that region. So we don't really expect participants from that region. Just a couple of seconds. So please participate in the poll if you haven't. Great, thank you so much. I'm just going to share the screen so that share the results. So we have, it's great. We have people joining us from across the world. So this is really exciting. And on to the next question. We have which sector you work in. Once again, we've had really great participation from people working in a range of sectors. That's the whole goal of this webinar series, is to, we hope that it appeals to a range of people who work in, various sectors, and we can see that today. So that's very exciting. I'm gonna end the poll and share the screen. We've had most of our participants voting in this poll. So I'm just going to share the results. And as you can see, all sectors represented. So this is great. This is great. And now on to the final question, which is your involvement in climate change work. Once again, we are hoping that there's a range of people with different goals here. So please participate, and you'll see the results very soon. Great, a few more seconds. So if you haven't participated, please participate in the poll. Give it a few more seconds. So if you haven't participated, please do. Great, fantastic. So let me show you the results. This is once again really exciting. We have really people, a range of, some people are interested in wanting to learn more, some wish to educate people more, and then, there's a little under half who work directly on climate change. So this is really fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Also, we'd like to get to know you more on an individual level as well. So please, if you wish to, please start by introducing yourselves in the chat and share as much information as you like. Feel free to include your name, country, institution, role, email, how you think this book might be helpful to you. And I'll also put that in the chat, so that helps you with your introduction. And on to the next slide, and then I would like to invite Cynthia to introduce our speaker today. Over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Manishka. It gives me such great pleasure to introduce my very long time and dear colleague, Gary Yohe. I was just trying to think where we met. I think it must have been in an airport on the way to an IPCC meeting.
Of course it was in an airport.
And they're in an airport. And there was one also in which we got stuck, and we're on our way to Japan. And, it was, had to reroute across the world. Just many, many tales of the IPCC together. But what I want to highlight is the great contribution and contributions that Gary, through the years of IPCC, made to Working Group 2 on vulnerability, impacts, and adaptation in particular. And in particular, bringing the concept of risk and risk management to the real intellectual foundation of Working Group 2, of IPCC Working Group 2. In terms of his institutional connections, he is emeritus at Wesleyan University, where he was the Huffington Foundation Professor of Economics and Environmental Studies. As Manishka said, he has some very, very key critical papers that conceptually move things forward, as I said, for impacts and adaptation. For the IPCC, he developed the foundation concept of flexible adaptation pathways. That's a very critical paper, Gary, that has had also huge contribution to the field. And that paper that Manishka mentioned, I wish I had been an author on that. we discussed it. I know it, and that's one of my regrets. We always have a few regrets. But that was with Camille Parmesan, I believe, yeah. And it's just so great that contribution. And then IPCC, he was a senior member from senior author there from 3rd to 5th, and preparing the synthesis report, and finally turning to our own country and the national assessments of the United States. He served as vice chair of the 3rd US National Climate Assessment. So with all of this, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Our Warming Planet webinar series and to your talk on a risk management approach to climate change. Absolutely critical, a critical contribution that you have made, and examples from the IPCC. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
And while we have Gary getting
Trying to
his
figure out how
slides
to
up.
do this.
No, take your time, Gary. We actually have Bill Travis. I think was raised his hand. So I'm going to allow Bill to say a few words if you'd like to. Bill?
Oh, sorry, I was just asking whether the chat was disabled.
It shouldn't be, but I'll just double check. Thank you, Bill. Great, Gary, we see your slides, so you can get started whenever you're ready.
I have to make the move.
Yes. Yeah, maybe just try PowerPoint. Okay, great. Great, fantastic.
We're up and running. Thank you. Wow, this is it's so astonishing to be here and to see where all you all are from in the survey. I would like to provide a little bit of background, maybe 30 seconds worth of what's behind my head. And on my right shoulder is of course the book. And then there's some golf clubs. And this is because a number of us who were working with Martin in Working Group 2, and he always put us in very nice places, would always sneak out. We would be in charge of author teams and stuff. And they would always look tired and say, why don't you take the morning off? And we would go play golf. And there was one time in Australia where unfortunately the end of our round ended up underneath the clubhouse on the 18th hole where lunch was being served. And the chair of Working Group 2 happened to notice that 3 of his lead authors were not having lunch, had not been in meetings all morning, and we're actually trying to finish the round. And I actually had a really good score. And he came out on the green and stood right in front of me. And so that sort of annoyed me as much as we annoyed him. But anyway, I was hoping Martin would be here. He remembers it. I know he remembers it. And so that's my little bit of geography. The second bit, here's the table of contents. We were all invited to do this 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago, something like that. And we worked on it, but our products are 2.5 years old. And it struck me, Cynthia gave me the opportunity to make revisions and edit the slides and stuff. Why don't I give a talk based on the slides that we produced 2.5 years ago? And this will be filmed, and my comments that will try to bring them up to date will show people how to take these slides and move forward. So that's what I'm going to try to do. We'll see how it works. Cynthia's nodding her head. That's really good news. So the context, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, among other things, said that it's the responsibility of the countries of the world to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at atmospheric levels that will prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. That happened in 1992. I'm not sure how much progress we've made, but part of the problem was, what does dangerous mean? And Steve Schneider knew, but most of us didn't, and we had to work through that, but we came quickly to understand that the factors of time, space, scale, and who the decision makers are in this century and in this decade, it's the opinion makers. Who are they and how do we communicate with them? The role of science. Okay, so the Framework Convention said we're gonna negotiate about climate change. We don't know a damn thing about it. So maybe we should talk to some scientists who have been working on this problem. So they created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988. There might have been 40 people on the planet that had any idea what the question was about. But they did create IPCC and it blossomed. It was, and this is really important, proscribed from designating what is dangerous and what policy could be. We were expected to calibrate risks. We were expected to calibrate response options and risks associated with response options. And all of the signatory countries of the world came to understand we have three choices. You either abate this, you reduce emissions, or you adapt to it, or you suffer. And it's a matter of how do you play that out. But if you ever hear Cynthia being quoted as saying, what the world should do is X, she is being misquoted. She's not allowed to say that, at least as a representative of the IPCC. I'm an economist, and economists tend to try to quantify everything, and the usual metrics is currency. For most of the risks that we're going to talk about with respect to climate change, that doesn't apply particularly well. So beginning in the third assessment, the working group 2 began to think about reasons for concern. And there were 5 of them. Risks to unique and threatened systems, risks associated with extreme weather events, risks associated with the distribution of impacts, that's economics, and the global aggregate impacts. Back then, that was economics too, and large-scale singularities, sudden things that would be big that you might not have thought of. Those have evolved. These slides were informed by the 5th assessment report, not the 6th. They were also informed by a paper in PNAS by O'Neill and his friends about the latest updates of key vulnerabilities. Inside the Beltway, when reasons for concern were brought up, a very influential country in North America was a little bit concerned that we were overstating things and getting dangerously close to defining what dangerous it might have been. So we described a process, Steve and Bill Hare and I, that we would look at backgrounds, key vulnerabilities that will inform our decisions about what was a reason for concern. They didn't exist at that point in time, but we convinced people that they would be, and here they are. And these are 5 years old, and you can look at the newspapers and find out that there's another 7 or 8 of them that we should probably add. This is what reasons for concern look like in the latest version of what was dubbed the burning embers diagram. And so, oh, look at this, I can move this. Risks to unique and threatened systems. At the beginning, that was polar bears and butterflies. Now it's communities and people that live in coastal communities and in hollers in Kentucky and places like that. Risks associated with extreme events. These are the drivers of a lot of the things that happen there. Associated with the distribution of things. Equity has over the last 10 years become a really important thing, concept. that IPCC is worried significantly about. But you do want to add it up, but you don't have to just add it up in dollars or yen or pounds and stuff. You can add it up in human lives or species lost or things like that. And then this is where anybody who's paying attention wants to know where they could win a Nobel Prize. Worry about tipping points. Worry about how you project tipping points, how you understand it. Put it in the context of not only the tipping points themselves, but who cares? What effects they will have and what are the thresholds for adaptation? Those are the messages for working group 1, working group 2, and working group 3. So go ahead. Lots of people are involved, lots of scales are involved. There's individuals, and you can go through there, but there are local decision makers, there are state decision makers, there are national decision makers, there are global decision makers. Up until about a week ago, when the senator from West Virginia decided that he would think about climate as something he would be willing to put forward at a national level for the United States, I had become convinced that you go from the bottom up, that you convince these people and these people and these people and these people that there are things that they can do and incentives that they would like to create, and that would show up in the COPs at the end of every year as some progress. I still believe that. Mishka and Cynthia were very kind in talking about what I contributed with my colleagues to thinking about climate change. These 30 words are what I think are the most important. They changed the world, the way the world looked at climate. In 2007, up until then, it was a cost-benefit problem. You add up the costs, you add up the benefits, you set marginal costs equal to marginal benefits, and you get a solution. No, that doesn't work. What is you need is reflect iterative risk management. What is risk? We'll talk about that in a minute. Cynthia was very involved in the development of this concept in the New York Panel on Climate Change. But notice that it says it involves both adaptation and mitigation. Okay, well, that's good. And then it has all these other things to worry about. Co-benefits, sustainability, equity, attitudes towards stress. You can qualitatively indicate those in terms of a risk management problem, even if you can't quantitatively describe them. So iterative means we're not clairvoyant. So we're going to have mid-course corrections. Risk is a statistical concept. It's likelihood times consequence, and that allows you to really organize your thoughts. Mitigation reduces likelihood, adaptation reduces consequences, and you're often thinking about it, but these 30 words tell you how to bring it back together. So you come up with decisions. There are two sides of any decision with respect to climate or any other thing that you might be trying to tell humanity to do. You might do too little, in which case you suffer unnecessary damage, or you might do too much, in which case you suffer unnecessary costs. And so you have to get people to think about their attitudes towards risks, their time preference. Do you want this to happen early? Do you want this to happen late? It sounds like an impossible problem, but Cynthia will tell you it happened in New York. It's happened in Miami. It happens around the world. There are major sources of uncertainty that have to be included in the calculation of risk. The physical system, the socioeconomic system, the consequences, the residuals, the cost of alternatives, you might not want to do anything, or something else, society's attitudes towards risk. And there's a sixth one, which is the picture on the left side of that screen. I have no idea what that's supposed to represent. So that is an enormous source of uncertainty. Scale matters. You can talk about people or small communities, large communities, states. There are a variety of different type of responders, and they all need to talk with each other and communicate with each other. They need to have an understanding of the 5 reasons for concern and their sensitivity to how the future might evolve. This is the one slide I'm embarrassed about 3 years later, because it is such a limited list of what adaptations might be considered and what mitigations might be considered. So that if you're looking at this presentation and you want to amplify something for your students, here's the place to go, and just watch the TV and watch the fires blow up and the hollers in Kentucky fill up with water, and there's plenty of things to do. This is the second most important thing that I think I've ever enunciated. There are no solutions to this problem. There are ways of going about adapting and reducing the consequences of the risks that you're facing and the hazards that you face. And there are ways of reducing the likelihood that those terrible things will happen. But the world doesn't have enough financial resources or natural resources to be able to protect itself completely from everything. And so disaster relief is the third policy option that you really, really have to think about. And here's a picture of what is what a residual damage might look like. To the left, it was before a terrible event happened. To the right, and there was a degree of adaptation to protect, and to the right is what remains. When New Orleans was thinking about how to respond to Katrina, they did not protect themselves from Lake Pontchartrain with respect to Category 5. They did it with respect to Category 3. Why not 4 or 5? They couldn't afford it. But 3 was better than where they were. Yeah, let's just. How do you try to think about the future? Here's a picture that was relevant and in play back when this was written. How do you think about what the futures might hold? And here's a picture, and here's some bar graphs, and it's really complicated. But here are some big lines that tell you if you really work really hard, emissions can fall, temperatures maybe fall, and probably won't, but at least they will stop going up so quickly. And you get a distribution of temperatures that you can relate back to stuff that you're thinking about. Or if you don't do anything, it could get really bad very quickly. No news there, except that the difference is enormous. So how do you try to calibrate that? What do you think about targeting trajectories towards 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees or 3 degrees? And you can project uncertainty distributions around that because of all of those 5 sources of uncertainty. And you get pictures like that. But how do you interpret those? Well, IPCC might say, go back to the reasons of concern. And here's one of them. Here is unique and threatened systems. And here is the picture from 2017 of the color codes. And here are the trajectories from emissions reduction scenarios, mitigation policy scenarios. And you can see the sensitivity, and you don't have to quantify this. You just have to get comfortable with, I really don't want to go above yellow, or I'm okay in the middle of red. Does that ever happen? Yeah, it does. We set speed limits. We decide that it's perfectly okay in the United States that 20,000 people a year die of the regular flu because we can't afford to protect everybody from the regular flu. Blah, blah, blah. And so here is a place that risk management tells you you could begin to organize your thoughts and have a reasonable conversation about the relative value of the mitigation strategies that you're talking about. And then back it up to say, how much do we want to adapt? How much do we want to take this red down to this yellow by making investments in protection? So, in concluding remarks, adaptation responses are easier to characterize in cost-benefit analysis does come into play, except when they have really long time horizons. At the global level, they are more difficult to characterize, mostly because they get longer term. Why is that a problem? Because you don't know what the longer term is going to be. And so the iterative part is, okay, when are we going to make the midterm correction? And are there midterm corrections that we can do? Cynthia may remember this story. I'm not sure she was in the room or I just made it up. But after the World Trade Centers came down, the person who was designing the new one came in and said, I'm about to put concrete in the ground. If you could tell me the direction of the prevailing wind in 2080 or 2090, I could rotate it by 15 degrees. What do you think? I don't know, Cynthia is shaking her head. Don't have a clue, just do what you want with it. But a long-term investment is problematic. And so there it is. Iterative risk management, scales matter. I'd love to hear questions. Thank you.
I'm the designated clapper. Thank you, Gary. Wonderful.
Thanks so much, Gary. Wonderful talk. Really great to have heard that live. And Jen, over to you to moderate the live Q&A session.
Sure. Thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. There are a couple questions coming into the chat, but I usually like to get started by asking, how do you see your climate research having evolved since when you first came into the climate arena to where you are now? Especially as a current student, it's always interesting for me and the other students to hear about this change.
What a great question. The short answer is that when I was hired by Wesleyan University, I was an applied microeconomic theorist, and I did decision-making under uncertainty. And I was going to write theoretical papers for the rest of my life. I did prices versus quantities, otherwise known as taxes versus cap and trade, with Marty Weitzman and Bill Nordhaus. And a couple of years after I got to Wesleyan, Bill Nordhaus phoned me up and said, would you like to be involved in a National Academy of Sciences, a panel on climate change and global warming? I didn't know what that was. I think that maybe there were 4 or 5 economists in the world at that point in time that knew what it was, but it seemed like a good idea. And I've always liked Bill, and you say yes to these things. So the answer is don't over predict and always say yes. Because out of that came a career of thinking about climate. Starting with mitigation and emission scenarios and stuff, but then going to adaptation. Richard Moss taught me a lot, Cynthia taught me a lot. and the economics worked out really well, primarily because I changed majors 5 times when I was an undergraduate. So I could talk to the chemists and I could talk to the biologists. I knew their vocabulary. Just listen, follow your nose, find a place like Wesleyan that allows you to, instead of being a theoretical economist who's going to do decision-making under uncertainty, and if you don't do that, we're not going to give you tenure, you're going off on doing something that's legitimate research. Go do it.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question from Kirsten Paff. Dr. Yohe, you talked about the responsibility of individuals to combat climate change, but what about the responsibilities of corporations? If corporations do not provide genuinely sustainable solutions rather than just greenwashed marketing campaigns, how are individuals supposed to make sustainable choices? How do we get corporations to make real changes if those changes are not in their short-term financial interest?
Wow, that's a very long question. I actually have an answer. And I hope pans out with respect to the Security and Exchange Commission, but I'm pretty sure it will pan out with respect to the Federal Reserve System. And the idea is, you are exactly right, corporations have to behave. Some of them are behaving pretty well, but some of them are just greenwashing, and I fully get that. So how do you make it in their best interest to take climate into account, both with respect to their vulnerability in their supply chain, in their product and their consumers, but also the emissions that they create and the risks that they create. So how does that work? The public comment period ended last week, but the Security Exchange Commission has decided that they would like to insist, and otherwise force corporations to respond and report material risks to climate change to their own businesses and from their business practices to their shareholders, so that when shareholders make decisions about where to allocate their money, they will look at companies that are very vulnerable to climate risk and say, I'm not so sure I want to put my money there. Or they will look at ones that are being very responsive and say, I think I really would like that. And what that allows is the individuals that you talked about to require, request, or otherwise incentivize corporations to compete on another level of competition. How are you behaving with respect to the climate? And you put your money where your mouth is. It might cost you some money. States can do that. Individuals can do that. And financial investment firms can do that. The other thing is the Federal Reserve System is now including catastrophic climate risks in their stress tests that they impose on the largest banks in the country every other year, to see how vulnerable or invulnerable they are to something that could be catastrophic. Or will this show up to look like 2008, 2009? And they are going to places like Colombia to ask for scenarios of a contagion that would distribute a climate risk so far that the central bank of the United States or the central bank of any country in Europe would be in jeopardy, and get people to think about that. Banks will respond to that, because otherwise they lose their licenses to do this or that or whatever. So that's where I think you can go.
Great, thank you so much for the thoughtful answer. And we have two more, these are actually both thoughts from William Travis. So let me read the first one. He says, very important to know and leave it to the economists to do so, that perfect adaptation, protection from all extremes may not be possible, or at least not make socioeconomic sense for New Orleans or anywhere. Impacts from current extremes do not necessarily imply maladaptation nor an adaptation deficit. Comments, Gary.
Yes, you're right. You can't be embarrassed because you don't completely protect yourself. Your kid falls off a swing in the backyard and lands on its stone and has a gash, not a gash, a wound on her leg. You can't let her get really, really mad that you allowed that stone to be there. I can't rake every stone every day and stuff, but I don't want to keep her from going out and enjoying the swing.
And we have the next, I'll read from William Travis. Risk analysts are comfortable with scenarios and quantifying unknowns. They're also natural Bayesians. But in many applications of climate scenarios, including model output that I follow, the tendency to work to a very large future range rather than something like a best guess or best model projection seems to throw away information. Your thoughts, Gary?
Spending your time worrying only about the best guess or the middle of the distribution is old-fashioned. It was what people did about 10 or 15 years ago, but risk management says that you can think about low likelihood, high consequence events without being accused of being a fearmonger, because that is something that you want to do. How do you do that in practice? I think you inform decision makers of the contingencies that generate the different scenarios. So for example, contribution of ice melt from land-based glaciers has been pretty widely known, and you add that to thermal expansion of the oceans and you can get some estimates of sea level rise, and they go off into the future and they're really pretty well predicted. And about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, people noticed that there was an acceleration in both the melting of Greenland, but also down in Antarctica. They observed an acceleration of the contribution of melt to global sea level, and generated another set of scenarios. And there's a distribution around them, but it's a higher one. And the likelihood of that is not even close to zero. So you really should take that quite seriously. And then there's something that there are a couple of glaciers in Antarctica that are being held up by vertical ice columns that are a mile and a half deep, and they are starting to disintegrate. And these are the things that are holding this enormous amount of ice from falling into the ocean. And some people think there would be other things in the way if the columns disappeared, or there are people that say this could create a foot of sea level rise globally in a decade or a decade and a half. That's a pretty serious thing. And so when you're making adaptation decisions, when do you take that into account? Not when you're building a wall for a decade or two, probably. But if you're building a building or a seawall for 80 or 90 years, you might want to take that really quite seriously. And that doesn't mean you build it high enough to prevent all of that, but you design it so that if it looks like you have to do that, you can just add it to the top. You don't have to start all over.
Thank you. Okay, we have one more question in the chat from Alex DeShervinen. And he says, hi, Gary. It is becoming increasingly apparent that the risks of climate change, or at least the speed of of those onset risks were underestimated in early reports of the IPCC. By now, most of the world has woken up to the fact that climate change risks are happening today and not something we only need to worry about in 2050 or 2075. In retrospect, do you think scientific understatement did a disservice to society, or would stronger language have been characterized as being overly alarmist?
With respect to the two parts of the last question, yes and yes. It did a disservice, but it was acting on the best the information, scientific information that was available. And it also had a cost-benefit perspective to it that said, you really can't worry about the tails. What you have to do is sort of average things together and work in the middle, or just work along the median, or report that. And up until that 2007 30 words, that was the way the world looked at the decisions that might be appropriate, and that was the way the IPCC was led to report its stuff. And so therefore it was very conservative. Not everybody was, Jim Hansen certainly wasn't, but he worried about the tails, and he was called a fearmonger. And through a cost-benefit lens, he was. But as soon as it became a risk management lens, and risk is likelihood times consequence, and you want to manage the product of those two things, you are suddenly allowed to report glaciers in Antarctica falling into the ocean and calling a decade and a half, or a foot of sea level rise in a decade and a half. Why? Because the science is clear, and that's something you should worry about. What science? It's the Antarctic science isn't particularly clear, but the risk management science is.
Thank you so much. We do have one more question that I'll ask very quickly. So it says, climate vulnerability is now visible in the developing world. What adaptation options should be taken to minimize these impacts?
That's a really big question. Usually when I'm in this situation and I don't know, I just say, I don't know. My other answer, because I'm an economist, is the answer to every economics question is it depends. And so as you go from one place to another in the developed or the developing world to think about adaptation options, the real question is, what are the decisions depending on? What are the timeframes? What are the vulnerabilities? What are the scale of the hazards? And how do you put that into account? And also, how frequently can you make iterations? Because there was that one slide, you can either be too early or too late. So you have to think about the time dimension as well.
Thank you everyone for your contributions to the questions, and thank you, Gary, so much for your thoughtful lecture and answers to the questions. And I'll pass it off for wrap up unless Cynthia or David have other further comments and questions. Thank you.
Cynthia and David, do you have any questions or comments for Gary? Great.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, Gary. Really so cogent, bringing forward the really key contribution that risk management approaches have made. And thanks also for the great questions that people put forward, and thanks for your answers. I think it was a really fruitful and constructive discussion. So now we turn to wrap up, right, Manishka?
Yes, that's right.
So
thank you,
I want to say quickly, it's been at least 4 years since I've seen Cynthia's face, and it's very nice to see you again, and Manishka as well. But thank you, Bill. Thank you. This is like old home week.
Yes, that's what the whole webinar has been like, and introducing the authors to this wider audience through the webinar that Manishka has done, and Jen has helped so much to really bring this opportunity to really think about impacts and adaptation together. So all good.
Thank you. Thanks, Gary. You did a great job answering all those very challenging questions. And thank you, Jen, for moderating those. And thank you to everyone for sending all of those wonderful questions. And I think the Q&A session is really one of the really valuable aspects of the webinar series, is that, you know, we can chat with the people who've written those lectures, and, you know, we have that opportunity to interact with them. So thanks for participating. David and Cynthia, do you have any thing you'd like to say before we wrap up and talk about the upcoming lectures and such? And Jen, on to the next slide as well.
I think all good.
Great. I have put this in the chat and will send it across again. All the webinar recordings are now available. So if you've missed any, you can get them. You can just go to the NOAA CC Run website, and you can watch all of them. They'll be up there. You can, you know, on demand. So we think that that'll be a very useful resource to a lot of people. And I want to also mention that a lot of you, when you registered for a number of webinars, but we have added new ones, so you don't automatically get registered for those. So please click on this link in the chat. We'll paste it in a second. Please go and register, because we have some new ones added in September and October. And and on to the next slide, Jen. So when you sign up, you'll there are a couple more that we are still scheduling, so it does go on till October 26th. But we now have the next 4 dates and speakers for those confirmed. So that's what's coming up. And use this link in the chat. I'm gonna send this in the chat to register, because even if you registered for the past webinars, you might still not get the automatic Zoom reminders for these. So go ahead and register for that. Before we wrap up, I want to thank Cynthia and David for the critical role they played in both the book series and the webinar series. And also to Jen, who's been very supportive from the very beginning. And thank you to our wonderful speaker, Gary Yohe, as well. Really great to meet you in person and hear your lecture. Meet you virtually. It feels like in person, because this is, I think, as good as it gets these days. You know, the objective of the book and the webinar series was to reach as many students, teachers, professionals, and all interested people across the world. And as we saw from the poll, we do actually have people from different sectors and regions from across the world. So we really hope that this will be valuable for people, especially in regions with limited resources. So thank you so much, everyone, for your participation, and hope to see you in a couple of weeks. We'll send reminders out to everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Manishka, there's a question about the recordings and whether they could be used, downloaded and used.
Yes, I mean, if you wish to, you can.
Yes.
If it's possible for you to download, I think there are ways in which you can download it from YouTube. So yes, you can, for sure.
Yes,
Yes.
Those are not licensed, so they are available for use.
Yes.
And at least one author agrees with that.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful
Thanks,
day.
everybody. Great. Thank you. Bye, Gary.
Bye-bye, Cynthia.